This is my son, Nick. He's a filmmaker, and he has a tattoo of me by Christoph Niemann. He had it stuck in with needles. He auditioned many illustrators before selecting Christoph's rendition, including Seymour Quast, who seemed to have failed. And the question is, what other father in this audience can boast a tattoo portrait on his son's shoulder? Hands. This is me at 6 years old. I was an all-American boy, and it speaks for itself. This is me at 6 or 7 years later as an all-American cadet as Valley Forge Military Academy in Pennsylvania. This was just at the time of the Vietnam War. And here I am again 5 years later, and 6 months before being kicked out of the School of Visual Arts, where I now devise and co-chair graduate programs. America is a beautiful place. But this talk is not about my prepubescence, infancy, or adolescence. Rather, it's how I'm motivated to chronicle the history of graphic design in broad terms. Perhaps it will be of interest to some of you, if only for the eye candy you'll soon get to feast upon. This actually marks the point where my life conflates with popular and design history, and where that history becomes part of my life. See, at 17, I was art director of the New York Free Press, a liberal left weekly. I knew nothing about designing, as you can tell. However, I did know that during this anti-Vietnam War period, my friends and I were being spied upon by these men. They were all cops but one, and we were sued by the one. Left-wing politics were a hard sell even in the 1960s, so the underground press spiced up its offerings with a good, wholesome hunk of nudity. Sales always rode precipitously when we did. Incidentally, for the art lovers among you, the celebrated Japanese artist Kusama supplied us with all our orgy photos. The polka dots were her trademark, and still are, actually. She's still alive. From the Free Press, I moved on to Screw, the first underground sex tabloid paper ever published. I still knew nothing about graphic design and production, probably even less than I knew before. But with the help of some mentors, I developed a sense of design and typography. I became a maven for illustration and loved working with illustrators. This is a cover by Philippe Weisbecker, one in a series called Chairs in Love. Incidentally, Pushpin redesigned Screw. Milton Glaser, who was talked about yesterday, designed the logo with the erect E. He used Helvetica, however, and after a year of looking like an annual report, I made the logo into a balloon and changed Glaser's Lightline Gothic cover lines to News Gothic. For a year, I also published a classier rag called the New York Review of Sex. It was classy because it was printed on heavy paper and had full-color illustrations and was called the New York Review of Sex. I was arrested twice for pornography, once when I was a minor. I should have been arrested for mixing these type styles. But it wasn't all adventures in the sex trade for this 18-year-old. I was also art director and designer for Rock, a music magazine, and I made this logo with my very own compass. And I was briefly the designer for Andy Warhol's Interview magazine, where I criminally mixed Broadway and Bussorama typefaces. Today, that would be a capital offense. I also worked on the East Village Other as a designer, and I was art director and designer for the New York Ace, a second-generation underground. The East Village Other logo, by the way, was an eye, so you can guess at the meaning of this cover by the recently departed cartoonist Yossarian. I was even the co-publisher and art director of this satire mag, Mobster Times. It was as much about political malfeasance as mobster behavior. J. Edgar Hoover and Richard Nixon were our resident bad boys. Because of all this counterculture activity, and ultimately to my great surprise, in 1974 I was hired as an art director of the New York Times op-ed page. I was 24. A few years later, I became art director of the New York Times Book Review. I was one of 3 art directors who graduated from Screw. Turned out it was like doing Screw, but with better typesetting equipment. I was able to exercise my love for books, type, comics, satire, and popular culture. It was the best job in the world, and I lasted there for about 33 years. What's more, even at the risk of being beheaded by the chief editors, I had Chris Ware alter the book review logo. Although after the fact I was ordered never to do it again, it went through, and I did do it one more time and was ordered not to again. So what I'm really going to talk to you about today is how an addiction developed into a calling. I'm addicted to visual design objects of all kind, especially graphic design. My book partner and best friend, Seymour Quast, was kind enough to prepare this diagram of drugs I should be taking. There's the one that decreases desire, the book reducer, the calmer of typographosis, relieving uptake of buying new stuff and more stuff, and my bad taste inhibitor, which doesn't quite work all the time. I do wish something like these drugs were sold over the counter, so I wouldn't get to look like this every time I see an object I can't live without. This was before I had my beard. Then maybe I could go back to living in an apartment that doesn't smell like molding paper and cater to silverfish. These are my addictions. This is what I'm addicted to. Anything politically and socially propagandistic, book covers and jackets of the 1920s through 1950s, advertising mannequins, matchbook graphics, letterheads, labels, wet paint signs, point of display, triptychs, rare design reference books and magazines, and I have stacks and stacks of rare magazines. I have scores of product mascots poised to pounce. There are French easel ads, tins of all kind, underwear boxes, and even a fair share of Paul Randania. And did I forget to mention razor blades, milk cartons, milk carton caps, speedball pens, pencil boxes, little people, miniature furniture, and even once common examples of racist imagery? Which brings me to why I collect. I collect to fulfill some neurotic obsession, to be sure, but like many collectors, there must also be a loftier rationale. Take these French advertising fans. They are part of a large collection that is devoted to methods of promotion using Art Moderne or the Art Deco style. You see, I'm less interested in the fan than in what or who it represents, the economy, technology, aesthetics, and so on. I'm also interested by how styling, even the most mundane consumables, would cause buyers to have an uncontrollable desire to consume what was being offered them. I wanted to know why certain forms and representations had that impact on others and on people, and others did not. What is the visual code that needs to be cracked to understand consumption? It's obvious that in a world of cosmetics, style is everything. But why did somebody design this postcard for this unsexy pencil, and why did it sell better with its Art Deco background than without? Or what about this artful package? Was Ernst Elmo Calkins, who invented styling the goods in the US, right about the aura, about aura being more important than function? I'm not sure what the answer is. I'm not sure whether I answered all the questions, but my reason for collecting is to make books, articles, and exhibitions. This is one based on an Art Deco series I did with my wife, Louise Feely. And here's another example. One day I found myself collecting mini mannequins, or what I call sculptures of commerce. They came in all shapes and a few sizes. Most were clothed with professionally tailored miniature garments. And this one, for Lego tards, is my favorite. Second only to the lady in red so beautifully articulated next to her. And between you and me, we're all friends here, they come alive at night and we talk a lot. As an offshoot of my mannequin mania, 3D characters like this dude for Blatz fell into my purview. What fascinates me is how sensual they are. They evoke specific emotions, wistful auras. My son says I play with dolls. But it's more than that. I play with designed objects of commercial cultures. Who's to say, not you or me, that this is not the Roman or Greek statuary of the 20th century? These heads, bodies, feet, and toes are every bit as celebratory as those of the Caesars and saints. And look at these women. Many were, in fact, fashioned after real models. They were made by anonymous designers entirely ignored in our design history canon. With these objects, I've created a narrative that is not just about graphic design, but all manner of industrial fashion, advertising display, and other fields that merge together. These objects fit in a material cultural context and show how, before high technology, the fashion industry used graphic objects to promote itself. Louise and I produced this book, Counterculture, which visually chronicles the extensive nature of this stuff. Basically, we did it because I just love the stuff and I want to have it, and Louise goes along with it as long as she doesn't have to go into the apartment. For graphic design historians, archives and libraries are simply not enough. Uncovering this history requires a certain amount of archaeology. Without putting too much of an "I'm trying to justify my illness" spin on things, I like to think of my collection as an archaeological dig. And I've discovered the remnants of commercial culture, much of it very rare. So, that's why I'm an incurable addict. Now I'd like to share some projects that literally have arisen from the collections in that space that you just saw. Like all graphic designers, I revere type and typography, and I've collected typographic artifacts of all kinds, from the influential old metal foundries like Deberny Pignot in France, to the so-called vernacular of everyday objects like bus and subway signs. Typographic styles are indicators of certain types of culture, and tracing the timeline is endlessly fascinating. This was produced by a young student in the MFA Designer as Author and Entrepreneur program at MFA, and it's based on the book that Louise and I did called Typology. We've done many books together, although she refuses to set foot in that cave I told you about. We are just finishing one that looks at different type forms, including scripts, which came out, stencils, which will come out in a few years, and the most recent, which will be out in the fall, called Shadows. Shadow type is one of the most prevalent type styles for achieving dimensionality. And this is it, our forthcoming effort. Another of my obsessive interests is magazines, notably avant-garde, alternative, or counterculture magazines like the Dutch Vendigen. This returns to my days of the underground press. Alternative publishing of art and artsy magazines were acts of passion, like this Broom, and this Het Overzicht, a Belgian journal. Magazines like John Hartfield and George Gross's Every Man His Own Football was the true beginning of the 1960s undergrounds, except this was done in the 1920s. And there is a grunge or punk quality to this 20s Romanian journal, Integral. And what about the 30s Polish avant-garde review, Block? It looks just like work that came out of Cranbrook in the 1980s. All this is in my book, Mares to Emigre. I wanted to call it Unacceptable, but that was what the title was to my publisher. A number of years ago, I realized I had collected hundreds of past and present graphic design magazines, and what a store of history they are. 2 years ago, I began working with the English designer Jason Godfrey on a book for the great Lawrence King publishers that documents 100 of these magazines inside and out. Some, like Das Plakat, are legendary. Others, like Das Zelt, are rare. I have my favorites, both for their content and design, like De Reclame, an advertising magazine from Holland during the 20s, which introduced a form of modernism to Dutch professional advertising. It's important to see the distinct relationship commercial design had and has with art, how one feeds another. As in this cubistic cover, or borrows bits and pieces, as you see in this Czechoslovakian advertising journal. I could have done at least 2 more volumes, but securing the rights to all the content, the history of design for over 100 years, was incredibly difficult, and I'll talk about that at another time when I can rant. There's a dark side to my obsessions as well. As designers, we make marks. One of the most horrific yet enigmatic marks is the swastika. The Nazis used it, Hitler claimed credit for it, but it has a long history. A benign history that is manifest in places like the Idaho Corn Palace in the United States. It burned down owing to the methane given off by the decaying corn that formed the arabesques on the outside of the building. Only the swastika survived. Or the Girls Club emblem and how to get it. And they had a title of their magazine, which was the swastika. Today, there are slightly more righteous applications, though in questionable taste. So I wrote the book, The Swastika, A Symbol Beyond Redemption, to explore the complex narrative of the symbol and develop what I call a critical history. Rather than being an exhaustive scholarly inquiry, it's a question about the symbol's ability to be reclaimed and changed into its original form. Look at the lovely guy with the cigarette. He's supposed to be 8 years old. The work I did on the swastika got me extremely interested in how totalitarian regimes, the major 20th century ones in particular, created visual representations and mythic appearances that captured the hearts and minds of its citizens. I began collecting German, Russian, Chinese, and the above Italian fascist artifact. Much of it is on paper, but sculptures of mascots, large and small, were produced by all regimes. These are 2 of many Maos I have. The Michelin Man peering from behind has no political conviction whatsoever. The Maos are still being produced, if not in China, in other areas where they seem to sell. During the course of the Chinese Cultural Revolution, these figurines were distributed in abundance, like religious icons. They were cherished in households. Many told stories, this one of the anti-Mao reactionary bureaucrats who were accused of undermining the revolution and humiliated in public. And here are 2 more porcelain reenactments of the routine punishment of these undesirables. The worker and the militia were celebrated, and Mao's little red book was held high. And of course, Mao and his crew were sanctified by being cast as idealized sculpture. Don't break them if you don't want to go to a prison. This is part of the content of my book, Iron Fists, Branding the 20th Century Totalitarian State, which I noticed is up in the book area. All the research materials were donated to the Wolfsonian Museum in Miami Beach, which I urge you to go to because it's a fantastic museum of graphic design. Except for the little Chinese sculptures, I simply got attached to them and won't let them out of my sight. As a kid, the threat of an all-out nuclear war was the promise of the Cold War. And like most kids in New York, I had recurring nightmares about the seeming inevitability. As though to will it away, I would indulge myself in the fear. This included collecting the many printed cautions and warnings of doomsday. Of course, the Soviet Union was America's enemy, so it was difficult not to be afraid of their specter. I learned much later the lengths gone to trigger our fears were calculated and absurd and caused more neurosis and other behaviors than were necessary. So that same year I worked on the swastika, I did a book called Red Scared with Michael Barson, which shows how pervasive was the propaganda of the commie menace era. And also, how it was depicted in the mainstream arts and media. It was everywhere. And this cover on the New York Post was illustrating the book and ultimately the movie Failsafe, which gave me nightmares for many a day. But there were also those who warned against atomic devastation, like Robert Osborne, who drew this after the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He had been working for the United States Navy doing cautionary publications for flyers who were ditched in the sea and soldiers whose weapons were not working on land. And Ben Shawn, who supported the organization SANE for a sane nuclear policy, which was also an organization that was supported by many of the designers and illustrators in New York, like Milton Glaser and Seymour Quast. Throughout my adulthood, the threat, the fear, the inevitability subsided. There seemed to be a quiet on that front because there were proxy wars going on everywhere else. And then 9/11. After 9/11, the government brought it all back again with Homeland Security. Even the name Homeland Security is chilling. Fear is a great way to keep people in line. And I've been avidly collecting material graphically designed to increase fear levels in all of us. I will end this talk with a vivid example about how fear is manifest in popular media.
Damn you! God damn you all to hell!
If you're in America right now and you're following the gun lobby and gun legislation arguments, now you'll know why we need guns. Actors like Charlton Heston. So I collect because I am, because it's there, but because it also leads to other things that hopefully will have more impact on other people. Thank you very much.